Sometimes, the most powerful moves in global politics don't happen on battlefields or in boardrooms, they happen in the quiet shifts of alliances, in the way one nation learns to play the long game while another is distracted by short-term wins. Today, I want to take you on a journey into a story that isn't just about India or Africa or even America. It's about strategy, influence, and the surprising ways power is reshaping our world. The title might sound bold. India just used Africa to outsmart America, but by the end of this talk, you'll see how what looked like a simple partnership has actually changed the balance of power on the global stage. India's strategic investment in Africa's infrastructure and technology is not just about building roads, bridges, or communication networks. It is about laying down the foundation of a new global partnership that quietly challenges traditional power structures. Over the last decade, India has carefully positioned itself as a development partner rather than a dominating force. Instead of adopting a top-down model where one country dictates terms, India has framed its investments as mutually beneficial, where Africa gets the tools for growth and India secures long-term influence. This shift is critical because for decades Africa was often treated as a resource hub for extraction by larger powers. India, however, approached it differently by offering tangible solutions in infrastructure and technology that directly impact people's lives. For instance, in many African nations, India has been deeply involved in building essential infrastructure roads that connect rural farmers to urban markets, railways that link ports with industrial centers, and digital systems that allow governments to manage services more efficiently. These projects are not flashy, they are practical, and they create lasting goodwill. By enabling African economies to become more self-sufficient, India ensures that its role is remembered not as one of exploitation, but as a partner in progress. Moreover, India has made sure that many of these projects are financed through concessional loans and development partnerships, instead of the kind of debt traps that Africa has often faced with other major powers. This difference in approach has made India's involvement far more acceptable and sustainable in the long run. Technology is another key arena where India has strategically invested. Unlike countries that only export expensive and often inaccessible technology, India has shared affordable, adaptable innovations. A clear example is digital payment systems and e-governance models, where India's own experience with platforms like Aadhaar and UPI has been replicated in parts of Africa to increase financial inclusion and efficiency. By helping African nations leapfrog traditional stages of development, India is not just transferring technology, it is exporting an entire model of growth that prioritizes accessibility and scale. This creates long-term dependency, but it is seen as positive because the technology is empowering local populations instead of merely serving foreign corporations. Education and skill building are closely tied to this strategy. Thousands of African students pursue higher education in India, particularly in fields like information technology, medicine, and engineering. This creates a generation of professionals across Africa who have personal and professional ties to India. Over time, these alumni become leaders, decision makers, and innovators who naturally favor partnerships with India over other global powers. In a sense, this is soft power at its most effective, building influence not by force, but through trust and shared progress. What makes this approach so clever is its long-term vision. Infrastructure and technology are not short-term projects. They shape the trajectory of nations for decades. By embedding itself in Africa's growth story, India has secured both economic and diplomatic capital that America often overlooked. While the United States focused heavily on military presence or isolated aid programs, India quietly built bridges, literally and figuratively, that cannot be ignored. This is why observers argue that India's investments in Africa are not just development initiatives, but strategic masterstrokes that shift the balance of global power. Africa today is no longer the continent that was once dismissed as merely a passive recipient of aid or a battleground superpower rivalry, it has begun to emerge as an active and assertive partner in shaping global politics, economics, and diplomacy. When we look at the way India has engaged with Africa in recent years, the relationship highlights this transformation clearly. India has not treated Africa as a silent participant, but as a collaborator whose voice matters on issues that range from trade and security to climate change and global governance. This shift is significant because it shows that Africa is no longer just being acted upon, it is actively influencing outcomes and rebalancing global equations. One of the most striking examples of Africa's rise as a partner is the way its leaders are leveraging relationships with different global powers to serve their own national and regional interests. Rather than aligning blindly with one bloc, African nations are diversifying their partnerships, inviting investment and technology from India, China, the European Union, and even the Gulf states, while still maintaining relations with the United States. This flexibility gives Africa bargaining power it did not previously possess. In essence, Africa has become the chessboard where strategic moves by rising powers like India play out, but unlike in the past, African nations are not simply pieces on that board, they are becoming players themselves. India recognized this early and adjusted its diplomacy accordingly. The India-Africa Forum summits are a testament to this acknowledgement, where dozens of African heads of state come together with Indian leadership to outline agendas collectively rather than receiving pre-designed proposals. This collaborative model reinforces the idea that Africa is shaping the conversation instead of being a passive listener. Issues like food security, renewable energy, digital technology, and skill development are discussed on equal footing. By treating African leaders as peers, India not only strengthens its credibility, but also validates Africa's position as an emerging global partner. Economically, Africa's role is even more critical. With one of the fastest growing youth populations in the world, abundant natural resources, and expanding markets, Africa represents the future of demand, labor, and innovation. Nations like Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, and Ethiopia are already influencing global supply chains, trade negotiations, and technology adoption. India, by aligning its growth with Africa's, ensures that both parties benefit from this trajectory. It is no coincidence that Indian companies are heavily involved in African sectors like pharmaceuticals, mobile connectivity, and renewable energy. These investments empower African economies, but at the same time, they give Africa leverage in defining the terms of its engagement with global players. Politically, Africa's growing influence is also reflected in global institutions. Whether it is at the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, or climate negotiations, Africa's collective bargaining power is becoming harder to ignore. India has actively supported Africa's demand for permanent representation at the UN Security Council, knowing well that aligning with Africa's aspirations builds long-term alliances. This again highlights the fact that Africa is being recognized as a decision-making force rather than a passive background actor. Ultimately, Africa's role as a rising partner is about shifting perceptions. For too long, it was seen as a continent in need of saving. Now it is a continent that other powers must engage with to secure their own strategic futures. India's recognition of this reality and its willingness to act on it is what sets it apart from nations like the United States that often underestimate Africa's agency. In this sense, Africa is not being used. It is actively choosing its partners, and India has been smart enough to position itself as one of the most trusted among them. For decades, the United States has underestimated Africa's role in shaping global power, often treating the continent as an afterthought in its foreign policy. While Washington's attention remained focused on Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, Africa was largely engaged through aid programs, counterterrorism partnerships, or health initiatives. Though important, these efforts were narrow and transactional. They did little to build long-term diplomatic trust or economic interdependence. This neglect created a vacuum, leaving room for other powers, particularly India and China, to step in and build meaningful, mutually beneficial relationships with African nations. What looked like oversight from America has now turned into one of its biggest strategic disadvantages. The absence of a consistent U.S. strategy toward Africa is striking when compared to India's and China's approaches. America's policies have often been reactive, responding to crises like civil wars, terrorism, or humanitarian emergencies, rather than proactive in supporting Africa's development or integration into global markets. African leaders have long felt that the United States engages only when it serves American security interests, not when it comes to empowering African economies or voices in global governance. This perception has damaged America's credibility and opened doors for countries like India, which offer a partnership model centered on shared growth. India has capitalized on this gap by presenting itself not as a distant superpower, but as a fellow member of the global South that understands Africa's challenges. Where America was slow to invest in infrastructure or digital ecosystems, India was quick to offer affordable solutions. Where the United States focused on aid, India emphasized trade. For African nations, this difference is crucial. Aid can be short-term and dependency-driven, but trade and investment create sustainable growth and jobs. By showing up with tangible solutions, roads, railways, power grids, IT systems, India has gained trust that America failed to cultivate. This neglect has also undermined U.S. influence in multilateral forums. African countries make up more than a quarter of the votes in the United Nations General Assembly, and their collective support can tip the balance in global decisions. Yet the U.S. often underestimates this power block, choosing instead to concentrate on traditional alliances in Europe or Asia. India, on the other hand, has openly supported Africa's demand for greater representation, including a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. This alignment has not only earned India goodwill, but also created alliances that America can no longer easily counter. Economically, the gap is even more visible. While U.S. companies have strong presences in sectors like oil, mining, and technology, Washington itself has not crafted a bold vision for African economic engagement. The African Continental Free Trade Area AfCFTA, for example, is one of the most significant trade developments in the 21st century, and yet America has played little role in supporting or integrating with it. India, by contrast, sees AfCFTA as a chance to expand its trade links and cement its place in Africa's economic future. The irony is that America had both the resources and the influence to be Africa's most trusted partner, but chose not to prioritize it. In doing so, it allowed India to step in with a smarter, more empathetic strategy. Africa has noticed this difference, and the shift in loyalties is already underway. What once was a blind spot in U.S. foreign policy has now become one of the biggest opportunities for India to rise on the global stage, turning American neglect into a decisive advantage for others. India's use of soft power in Africa has been one of its most effective strategies for building influence without confrontation. Unlike hard power, which relies on military might or economic dominance, soft power works through culture, education, trade, and shared values. India has understood that to win long-term allies, it needs to create bonds that go deeper than politics or money. This is why Africa has increasingly welcomed Indian presence, not as an imposed force, but as a partner whose people, traditions, and systems feel relatable and empowering. Education has been one of the strongest tools in this soft power approach. Thousands of African students study in Indian universities each year, many on scholarships funded by the Indian government. They come for engineering, medicine, information technology, and management programs, and when they return to their home countries, they carry with them not only professional skills, but also a personal connection to India. Over time, these graduates often become decision makers, entrepreneurs, or leaders who naturally lean toward cooperation with India. This is influence built not through pressure, but through trust and shared experience. Cultural exchange is another dimension of India's soft power. Indian films, music, and cuisine have found a warm reception in many African nations. Bollywood movies are popular in places like Nigeria, Egypt, and Kenya, where audiences resonate with the themes of family, struggle, and resilience. Indian festivals such as Diwali are celebrated by diaspora communities across Africa, and these events often bring together both Indians and locals, strengthening cultural bonds. This blending of traditions creates familiarity and goodwill, making India seem less like an outsider and more like part of the social fabric. Trade relationships also reflect India's soft power philosophy. Rather than focusing purely on extracting natural resources, India has invested in businesses that bring value to African societies. Indian pharmaceutical companies, for instance, have become essential suppliers of affordable medicines across Africa. By providing life-saving drugs at lower costs than Western companies, India has gained not only market share but also immense goodwill. Similarly, Indian firms have been active in agriculture, telecommunications, and renewable energy, often tailoring solutions to Africa's specific needs instead of imposing one size fits all models. These efforts strengthen the perception of India as a partner in progress rather than a distant superpower. Technology transfer has been another important aspect. India's experience in building digital infrastructure at scale, such as mobile banking and identity systems, has been shared with African nations looking to leapfrog older models. These initiatives are not just technical, but symbolic. They show that India is willing to share its developmental lessons rather than hoard them. For African leaders, this makes India an attractive collaborator, one that understands the challenges of poverty, inequality, and rapid population growth from first-hand experience. Perhaps the most subtle but powerful element of India's soft power is the sense of solidarity it projects as part of the global South. India positions itself not as a former colonizer or a distant power, but as a fellow struggler that has risen from similar challenges. This message resonates deeply in Africa, where memories of colonial exploitation remain fresh. By speaking the language of partnership, empathy, and shared history, India has carved out space that America often overlooks. What makes this approach strategic is that soft power cannot be easily challenged by rivals. Military bases can be withdrawn, trade contracts can be renegotiated, but cultural affinity, educational ties, and goodwill built through mutual respect are much harder to dislodge. By weaving itself into Africa's social, cultural, and economic life, India has built influence that is resilient, long-lasting, and far more valuable than short-term deals. For decades, Africa was often perceived through the lens of aid and dependency, where powerful nations extended assistance but tied it to political conditions or economic concessions. This model kept African nations in a cycle of receiving help without building sustainable autonomy. India, however, has reshaped this dynamic by engaging with Africa as an equal partner rather than a subordinate. The emphasis has shifted from one-sided aid to mutually beneficial cooperation in trade, investment, and development. This evolution is not only empowering African countries, but also strategically advancing India's global standing. One of the clearest indicators of this shift is the way India structures its financial engagement with African states. Instead of focusing solely on grants or traditional aid, India has provided concessional lines of credit that encourage growth-oriented projects. These loans often fund infrastructure such as railways, power plants, and water supply systems, which generate long-term economic value for the host country. Unlike aid, which can foster dependency, these investments promote sufficiency by strengthening the backbone of African economies. African leaders increasingly see India not as a benefactor imposing conditions, but as a collaborator in their development journey. Trade has been another powerful driver of this transition. India's imports from Africa include essential commodities such as oil, minerals, and agricultural products, while India exports pharmaceuticals, machinery, and IT services. This balance creates an interdependent relationship where both sides have something to gain. The African Continental Free Trade Area AfCFTA, which aims to unify the continent into a single market, presents enormous opportunities for India. Rather than treating Africa as a supplier of raw materials, India is actively positioning itself as a partner that can help African businesses scale up manufacturing, digital services, and renewable energy projects. This ensures that Africa benefits from value-added growth instead of being trapped in resource dependency. Education and skills development also underscore the shift from dependency to partnership. Thousands of African students are trained in Indian universities, while technical training programs equip African youth with practical skills. These initiatives go beyond charity. They create a talent base that fuels Africa's own industries while forging long-term ties to India. The knowledge transfer empowers Africans to design their own solutions rather than rely on foreign expertise. Over time, this cultivates a generation of leaders and professionals who see India not as a donor, but as an ally that invests in their independence. Healthcare offers another example. Indian pharmaceutical companies have become the backbone of Africa's access to affordable medicines. Instead of being locked into expensive Western supply chains, African nations now rely on cost-effective Indian drugs and vaccines. This not only saves lives, but also demonstrates how trade can serve humanitarian purposes without creating dependency. By delivering solutions that are both affordable and scalable, India has positioned itself as a reliable partner in addressing Africa's public health challenges. At the heart of this transformation lies a psychological shift. Africa no longer wants to be seen as a continent waiting for handouts. It wants to be recognized as a market, a partner, and a rising power bloc. India understands this aspiration and frames its outreach accordingly. By treating African states as equals, listening to their concerns, and collaborating on shared priorities, India has earned trust that traditional powers like America often failed to establish. This transition from aid dependence to equal partnership is not only changing Africa's trajectory, but also reshaping global geopolitics. For India, it means long-term allies who can amplify its voice in international forums. For Africa, it means dignity, agency, and the ability to shape its own destiny. Together, they are creating a new model of cooperation that undermines old hierarchies and signals the rise of a more multipolar world. Global power is no longer concentrated in the hands of a few Western nations, and Africa's growing alignment with partners like India is one of the clearest signs of this shift. For decades, the West, especially the United States, assumed it could maintain dominance through military strength, financial aid, and control of global institutions. But today, the landscape is changing rapidly. Africa, once overlooked, has become a central arena where new alliances are reshaping the balance of influence. India's smart engagement with the continent shows how global power is being redistributed away from traditional Western dominance toward a multipolar order where the global South plays a much larger role. This silent rebalancing of influence can be seen in how African nations are diversifying their partnerships. Instead of relying heavily on the United States or Europe, many are embracing India for technology, China for infrastructure, the Gulf states for investment, and even Russia for military cooperation. This diversification weakens the West's historical monopoly on African affairs. India stands out in this mix because it frames its engagement not as exploitation, but as shared growth. By investing in digital systems, affordable health care, and skill development, India strengthens Africa's autonomy while simultaneously expanding its own diplomatic footprint. The rebalancing is not just economic, but political. Africa holds 54 votes in the United Nations General Assembly, making it the largest regional voting bloc. When united, Africa has the power to sway global decisions on trade, climate change, or security. Historically, the U.S. and its allies often dismissed this collective influence. India, however, has taken a different approach. By openly supporting Africa's demand for permanent representation on the UN Security Council, India signals that it sees Africa as an equal stakeholder in global governance. This positioning not only wins goodwill, but also helps India secure vital allies in its own push for global recognition. Another layer of this shift lies in perception. Western narratives have often painted Africa as a continent of crisis, poverty, disease, and conflict. India approaches Africa with a narrative of opportunity and partnership. This framing matters because it affirms Africa's aspirations to be seen as a contributor, not a victim. As Africa's young population drives innovation in areas like mobile banking, renewable energy, and agriculture, India's recognition of this potential strengthens its own relevance while simultaneously weakening Western dominance, which has been slow to adapt. Economically, the numbers also tell a story. Africa's trade with India has grown steadily, especially in sectors like energy, pharmaceuticals, and technology. These connections create interdependence that rivals America's traditional economic influence. As African nations pivot toward markets that meet their needs more effectively, U.S. dominance in trade and diplomacy quietly erodes. India's ability to embed itself into Africa's growth story means that when Africa rises, India rises alongside it. This rebalancing is subtle but profound. It doesn't involve dramatic military confrontations or political standoffs. It happens through incremental shifts in loyalty, trust, and trade. By positioning itself as a partner of the global South, India has tapped into a narrative that Africa embraces, a world where power is shared, not imposed. As a result, the West finds itself gradually sidelined, not because of open hostility, but because nations like India are offering a more attractive alternative. In this sense, Africa has become the stage where the decline of Western dominance is most visible. The partnerships forming there, led by India's strategic engagement, point to a future where the global order is no longer defined by American influence, but by a network of emerging powers working together. This quiet but undeniable rebalancing marks one of the most significant geopolitical shifts of our time.